Most of the people who work here are out of the audience. No idea. No idea. I but I've only leave. I've just been contradicted. There's one of us. I'll keep it quiet. Keep it quiet. There you go.
Hello, ladies and gentlemen, can you take your seats if you have a seat? Apologies if you don't. If you're younger, like some of my students who I can see in the audience, it's incumbent upon you to stand up and give your seat to an older member of the audience. Welcome, lords, ladies and gentlemen, to Policy Exchange on this most eventful week in a most eventful year for a not unimportant event on US foreign policy under President Trump. Tonight's event takes place under the rubric of the Britain in the World project, which was launched at Policy Exchange last March. This is one of the events we wanted to have as soon as we launched, which is to bring Walter Russell Mead at some point over. Over the course of a few months of planning, we settled upon an event within the same week as the US presidential election. We thought that was good timing, we thought that would be eventful. And then, of course, the events of the last 48 hours have made it seem even more significant and eventful. Walter told me that he had some scribbled notes as to what a future foreign policy might look like under Hillary Clinton, which he may revert to, but won't be much use. And for my students in the audience, I will say it's a lesson that at some stages actually it is good to leave things to the very last minute. In terms of instant analysis, because that is what we're going to have tonight, I don't think you could find a higher caliber of discussion on the likely course of the next American foreign policy anywhere this week outside Washington D.C, and I dare say perhaps even within Washington D.C. itself. Tonight you will hear from two very different perspectives, but from an Anglo-American angle. I will hand over in a moment to our main speaker, but our second speaker and discussant to my far right, only geographically and not any other way, is Sir Nigel Sheinwald, who is a colleague of mine as a visiting professor at the War Studies Department at King's College London, former ambassador to Washington D.C. between October 2007 and January 2012. During Nigel's distinguished career in the British diplomatic and national security establishment, he also served as foreign policy and defence advisor to the Prime Minister Tony Blair and head of the Cabinet Office Overseas and Defence Secretariat 2003 to 2007. And before that, he was also ambassador to the EU from 2000 to 2003, which is an organisation some of you may have heard of. The main speaker tonight will be Professor Walter Russell Mead. Walter is the James Clark Chase Professor of Foreign Policy at Bard College, just outside New York, distinguished fellow at the Hudson Institute, editor-at-large of the American Interest, and a contributing writer at the LA Times, whose polling, I've got to say, was worse than anyone else's when it came to the presidential election. A regular contributor to the New York Times, Wall Street Journal, in which he has an article tomorrow, The New Yorker, The Atlantic, and numerous other publications. In 2012, Walter was given the Foreign Policy Research Institute Award, Benjamin Franklin Prize for expertise and excellence in the field of American foreign policy, and he's also the author of several books, including Special Providence, American Foreign Policy and How It Changed the World, which is the winner of numerous prizes, Power, Terror, Peace, and America's Grand Strategy in a World at Risk in 2004. It seems like very different days than it does today. And perhaps mostly appropriately from an Anglo-American perspective, his excellent book, which I fully recommend to you, God and Gold, Britain, America, and the Making of the Modern World in 2008. So I will hand over to Walter. Thank you.
Thank you. Well, I have to admit that as the election returns rolled in the other night, I was trying to think about what I was going to say here and reworking my notes, the first thought that came into my mind was I was going to come over here and say, "We're sorry, we take it back. Can we come home?" But you know, more sober thoughts came. But there are times when that whole experiment in self-determination seems, I don't know, leads to quirky results, and not just in the U.S. What I thought I would do is just sort of try first to put this election and the world in which President-elect Trump will have to make foreign policy into some kind of a context. Then I'm going to give you some thoughts about how Trump is likely to approach the tasks ahead of him, and maybe give some indication about some policies in some areas. Obviously, we're all at this point still speculating, but I think it's not a complete mystery where he comes from, and I hope that can become clear as we talk. The first thing to say is that it's impossible to understand both this election and the world in which Trump will be making foreign policy without understanding that we are in a moment of real historical crisis and upheaval. In some ways, the world order that came into being with the end of the Cold War is now being shaken to its foundations, and to some degree even the post-World War II order is up for grabs. And this is a fateful time, and it's not just fateful in terms of international relations, but also in domestic politics and economic development, cultural development within leading countries, both in the developed world and elsewhere. So it's a time of great change, anxiety, where people are really having to make major policy decisions on the fly, with public opinion in turmoil, and with many of our institutions not working the way that we like to think they work. So let me just quickly run down a couple of the sort of major facets of this crisis, which I think not only was responsible for bringing us Donald Trump and for a number of other interesting election results around the world, but may have had something to do with the Brexit vote here in the UK. One crisis that I've written about in Foreign Affairs is we're seeing a revival of geopolitics in world politics, that Russia, China, and Iran in particular, but also some smaller powers, don't like the post-Cold War order and would like to change it. In some cases, this involves the most traditional form of revisionism, that is, changing the size of your nation. But it also involves changing the ideological basis of international politics, changing or even in some cases weakening, undermining, destroying institutions that were intended to play a certain role. But we have people out there who are now actively trying, and in some cases making real headway, at shaking the world order and breaking the world order, at least the parts of it that don't work for them. And so while for many years after 1989, policymakers in Western capitals could really just sort of think about, okay, how do we construct a world order? How do we do sort of positive acts of statesmanship? There's now an increasing sense of having to play defense as well as offense, and it complicates the task of foreign policy in many ways. Beyond that, I think we've got a crisis of internal order in many countries. That is, the social order that appeared after the Second World War, where in many of the advanced industrial democracies you had mass prosperity based on mass employment in manufacturing and clerical work. People had jobs for life. They had stable and gradually rising incomes. This system was, brilliantly calculated to mute the class conflicts and international conflicts that had been so troublesome in the 150 years before the emergence of this world, of this new social model. in 1989, everybody in the West was pretty much certain that this model was permanent. This was the end of history. And that, in fact, in the future, cars might get nicer and televisions bigger and maybe more channels available, but that fundamentally social change was not going to be disruptive. Social change would be incremental and smooth. Our institutions, our political parties were built around these assumptions. Our culture had taken this assumption very much to heart. It's now clear that whatever is going on, that isn't happening. That we are seeing a real challenge to the stability and viability of this post-World War II social order. And you see manifestations of it in many different countries, but it's also an issue in developing countries as well as in the advanced ones, because the goal of industrialization, of development, was to create, to replicate in developing countries this mass prosperity based on mass employment in manufacturing that you saw in the First World. So that China is hoping to become what France was like in 1980, and is hoping to achieve social stability based on mass prosperity, mass employment, mass security. It's not going to be there. This is not just a crisis, a political crisis within the Western world. It is a significant change in the global outlook. We're also, I think, seeing a crisis in the institutions, in the international space that was developed after the Second World War and intensified after the end of the Cold War. So the World Trade Organization, the European Union, a whole range of organizations are both working less well than we expected them or hoped that they would be working. And they are losing legitimacy, partly because they aren't working as well, but also because we're seeing arguments over this international space. The arguments over trade agreements. Really? A bunch of corporate lobbyists are getting together in closed rooms and rewriting a bunch of things that they're calling a trade agreement, but is actually going to be the rules of the road for industry for decades to come, superior to acts of parliament. You call this democracy in action? So the trade agenda is bogging down. The World Trade Organization, we went to trade agreements like TTIP and TPP because the global process, the Doha round, had ground to a halt. Now increasingly these regional agreements are grinding to a halt. The UN is not working very well. I don't think many people actually think that the Paris Climate Agreement is going to solve climate change. I certainly do not. The European Union has been unable to solve the problems resulting from the flaws in the design and implementation of the euro, and that's just the beginning. So this international space that is a critical element of the post-Cold War and World War II order is not working well and coming under deeper attack. And that's from the outside and from the inside. So we see these various crises, and they impinge on voters in different ways. National politicians don't seem to have good answers. The establishment seems to be telling people, oh, just keep going about your business, we'll solve things, but increasingly it's hard to make the argument that they are solving things, and people are feeling left behind, angry. You're seeing a surge of identity politics, new forms of nationalism, new forms of sub-nationalism emerging, independence movements in places like Catalonia and, may I say, Scotland. There's a disaggregation taking place, and a sense of crisis is growing. So all of this, I think, helps us understand why Donald Trump could receive so much support when he was running against an experienced centrist politician who in many ways, to millions of Americans, is kind of the face of the establishment. Normally in American history, people vote for what they see as the safe choice in a political contest. This time we had enough people in enough states who felt that the establishment way was no longer the safe choice, that people were willing to try something different. And you have a candidate who is very, very different from any person who's ever taken high political office in the United States. Donald Trump has never, we've had people who've never had experience in politics, but they had often been in the military. Donald Trump has not served in the military. He's not held any government position. He hasn't been a legislator. This is new for us at the presidential level. So he's going to come to office in a world that is in a mess. These interlocking crises are getting worse and more difficult. So Donald Trump may hope that he can come into office and be kind of like Silvio Berlusconi and have a wonderful time as president, but it's not going to work out that way, in part because the United States isn't Italy, and we can't sort of go on break for a while without it having pretty serious international consequences, but also because the world is not going to leave Donald Trump alone. The world is going to reach out and interfere with any plans he may have for a quiet life in the White House. So how can we, I've spent a little bit of time, even before the election, trying to understand a bit about Trump's personality, the history of what he's thought and said, his record, and I can see sort of elements of 3 American presidents that we can look for in his leadership. I think we're going to see elements of a Trump presidency that are going to look and feel a little bit like Ronald Reagan, elements that are going to look and feel a little bit like Franklin Roosevelt, and elements that are going to look and feel a little bit like Andrew Jackson. And let me talk a bit about what those will be. I was on a panel last week with Larry Kudlow. I don't know if people here are familiar with him. He's an American financial journalist, very intelligent guy. He has a sort of one of these cable financial shows. He's known for being a bit of a supply sider and so on in his beliefs, but he's one of the few really prominent people in American kind of intellectual circles who came out as a strong backer of Trump. So at this meeting with Larry, who's spoken with Trump many times over the course of the campaign, I had a chance to sort of hear the intelligent person's case for Donald Trump. And by the way, it says a great deal about the way our media covered the presidential campaign that this was the first time I'd heard it, when I heard it directly from Larry. And I will share it with you. I didn't buy it enough to vote for Trump, but I think it does change my sense. And what Larry said is, look, here's his read on where Trump is coming from. Trump thinks that growth is what matters. That if the economy is growing fast enough, politics is going to become less bitter. International politics will also become less bitter. The best thing the United States can do for itself and for the rest of the world is to grow its economy. And that's more important than any other consideration. And that if you look at Trump's economic agenda, not so much the protectionist side of it, which Larry wasn't trying to defend, but the deregulation, some of the tax reforms he would like to do, Larry made, I thought, a strong case that these are pro-growth ideas. I think it was interesting that the stock market, after swooning on the news that that Trump was likely to win, recovered very smartly the next day. And this view may be taking hold. That was really Reagan's analysis back when he came in at the time. You know, when you had Jimmy Carter talking about malaise, you had the Iran hostage situation, the U.S. still in a bit of a funk after the Vietnam War. Ronald Reagan was saying it's time, you know, growth can give us optimism, can give us hope. It's morning in America. So in this sense, I think Trump will be trying to replicate that side of the Reagan agenda and the Reagan record. If he succeeds, it will certainly make a difference in American politics and perhaps even in the world. That, you know, I look at, for example, China, which is quite protectionist in many, many ways, yet the growth of the Chinese economy has enabled China to build very, very good relations with many countries near and far. One doesn't have to be a sort of dogmatic free trader for one's growth to become an attractive thing for other countries. And I could see a sense in which Trump may try to use this rapidly growing American economy as a sort of an incentive as he tries to make the deals that will advance his international agenda. May or may not work, but I think that we're going to see him trying this. So that's the Reagan side. What about the Roosevelt side? Franklin Roosevelt. If Franklin Roosevelt had left office after the normal 2 terms, which would have been 1941, he would not actually be thought of as a particularly successful president. The Depression had not really ended. The international situation had gotten much worse than when Roosevelt was sworn into office. And there was the Democratic Party was splitting and was clearly headed for some difficult times. We forget all that now, largely because of Roosevelt's success in wartime leadership. But when I look at the resemblances between Trump and Roosevelt, I actually see, I think, the seeds of some of the problems that we may see in a Trump administration. One way in which they're very similar is that it's hard for their subordinates to read them, and they keep them guessing. Famous story about Franklin Roosevelt in 1932, when he's flying to the Democratic convention, and his staff was divided into 2 hostile camps, free traders and protectionists. This is 1932, and each of them had been pulling at him, and Roosevelt had been refusing to be committed. Finally, the 2 chiefs of the 2 camps said, listen, we got to get him to decide, you know, win or lose, it's better to get a clear line. So what we're going to do is each of us is going to write a speech, that one of them is a strong pro-free trade speech and one of them is a strong protectionist speech, and get him to choose. That way we'll have some clarity. So they hand the 2 speeches to Roosevelt and they tell him, you really got to decide. And Roosevelt read the 2 speeches. He said, you know, these are both wonderful. I really like them both. Can't you weave them together somehow? All right. And this, you know, Trump has not really locked himself into any commitments at this point. He could, you know, nobody in America thinks he's actually going to get Mexico to pay for the wall. We're going to get Britain to do that. I haven't exactly told you how, but no. So he'll do something about immigration, but actually if you look carefully at the statements, anything from amnesty to deportation is sort of available. He's managed to get himself elected to president without any ironclad commitments. Not actually a mark of political stupidity to do this. This is very Rooseveltian. Furthermore, if you look at the way his operation works, it's more like a court than a bureaucracy. That is to say, everyone in the Trump circle is empowered on the basis of a relationship with Trump. Not, well, I'm the chairman of this policy committee, therefore what I say goes. It's Trump is the arbiter of everything that he wants to control. This again is the way Roosevelt kept his staff dancing. It's the way actually many leaders, Democratic and undemocratic, have done through history. You've got all, your staff is constantly, you set up rival centers of power, you set up rival ideological camps, they're all fighting to get your attention, they all look to you for decision. What this means is that you are in control. The circles around you are chaotic, but your control is clear. This is the way Roosevelt ran his government. I think it's the way Trump is going to run his. On top of that, they have another point of similarity, which was that Franklin Roosevelt, there were a lot of subjects that he did not know very much about, but which he had strong opinions on. Winston Churchill, by the way, was convinced that the British role in India was one of these subjects. That Roosevelt was very opinionated and very poorly informed. But China was another. Roosevelt's grandfather, Delano grandfather, had traded with China in the 19th century. And on the basis of this family connection, Roosevelt, who never visited China, frequently claimed to have a deep understanding of China and to know more about China than the China experts. This, by the way, is why China has a permanent membership seat on the Security Council, was because Franklin Roosevelt, out of his profound knowledge of China, believed that Chiang Kai-shek would be one of the great policemen post-war, and China should have this seat on the Security Council. So Trump, like Roosevelt, is an intuitive thinker with strong opinions that make sense to him, that don't withstand necessarily objective, rational criticism from other people, but that doesn't faze him. You know, Roosevelt was sometimes brilliantly right. Churchill, I think, also worked this way. Sometimes brilliantly right, sometimes catastrophically wrong. We don't know what Trump's batting average would be, but I think as we think about how will he operate in the White House, he's likely to operate in both these ways: the chaotic court system and the intuitive decision-making, very much like Franklin Roosevelt. Let's just hope he doesn't serve 4 terms, the last 2 of which are dominated by a great international conflict. The final president who I think we should look to in trying to understand Donald Trump is Andrew Jackson. Andrew Jackson is not as well known internationally as he should be. The British, I've heard complaints from my British friends about the American tendency to cast the Brits as bad guys in American movies, and especially in Revolutionary War movies. Andrew Jackson, in a way, is a father of this tradition. As a 13-year-old boy, he was captured as a guerrilla fighter in the state of South Carolina by British forces. He was fighting with the rebel irregulars. A British officer ordered him to shine his boots. The 13-year-old Jackson refused. The British officer cut him in the forehead with his saber, a scar that for many years to come would get votes for Andrew Jackson, right, left, and center across the United States. But Jackson was a fiery nationalist. He was the general in command of the American forces at the Battle of New Orleans, who defeated the British there. In 1818, there were 2 British subjects in what is now the state of Florida, but was then Spanish territory. Andrew Jackson was perturbed by these 2 Brits because they were, as we might say now, selling weapons of mass destruction to terrorists. That is to say, they were selling rifles and ammunition and liquor to Indians who were fighting the American forces in our state of Georgia. So Jackson knew exactly what to do. He sent U.S. forces under his command across the international frontier into Spanish Florida. He arrested the 2 British subjects, brought them back into American territory, tried them before a military tribunal, and hanged them. So right there you have everything that the European Union doesn't like about the United States to this day. And interestingly, this was in some ways a very rash act, because those of you who are up on your 19th century history know that at this time the French Bourbons were intriguing about supporting the Spanish Bourbons in restoring Spanish power in the revolted colonies, former colonies of Latin America, and they were trying to get the British to support them in this ambition. So nothing could have been more calculated to drive the British into the arms of the Bourbons than this act of killing 2 British subjects. But Jackson did it. It made him so popular that his election as President of the United States was simply a matter of time. This is the Jacksonian school in American foreign policy and American presidential leadership. It is populist. It is nationalist. It is very much, these are the people who voted for Andrew Jackson. Those are the people who voted for Donald Trump. Mostly white, mostly not particularly rich, not particularly well educated. They think of themselves as Americans first and last. They don't believe in spreading democracy around the world. They're not so sure that foreigners really want to be democratic or be like us. They have a live and live policy. If you don't mess with the United States, we won't mess with you. But if you attack the United States of America, we will take such a terrible revenge that you will never, never, never again even dream of attacking us. This was the Jacksonian response, for example, to the Pearl Harbor attacks of December 7th, 1941. On December 6, 1941, Americans, by a large majority, wanted nothing to do with World War II. December 8th, 1941, the question was, when are we going to kill the Japs who did this to us? And during that war, forget the atomic attacks on Nagasaki and Hiroshima, on one night in March 1945, U.S. forces dropped incendiary bombs over residential neighborhoods in Tokyo. More than 84,000 civilians were killed in that night. That is a larger number than the total of U.S. forces who died in the Vietnam and Korea and Iraq wars combined. Civilian casualties in one night. Again, not including the attacks on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. 900,000 Japanese civilians were killed in American air attacks in the last 5 months of the Second World War, which is more than twice the number of all U.S. military casualties in all our foreign wars from the Revolution to the present day. So this Jacksonian sense, on the one hand, you know, if Putin doesn't invade America, he can have as big a dictatorship in Russia as he wants, and we just don't care. It's not our business. But if Putin attacks the United States, then things change. This is, I think, very much behind Donald Trump. This kind of populist thinking in the United States tends to dislike and be suspicious of international institutions. It is not so interested in human rights and global order. It's nationalist rather than liberal. It's been a very important part of American politics for a very long time, and I think it's going to help shape Donald Trump's approach. So a little bit of Reagan, a little bit of Roosevelt, and a little bit of Andrew Jackson is going to be there. Though what I might do in conclusion is try to give a little bit of a sense of some concrete issues that where I think we'll see a Trump response. And but this is, this is all speculation. But there are, I think, some things that we can see. First, I think his core strategy will not make the climate activists happy. His core strategy is probably going to be, both domestically and internationally, the core of his strategy will be a renewed drive for American energy independence. The unconventional hydrocarbons, shale oil and shale gas, have, as many of you probably know, made the U.S. the world's largest oil and gas producer, and have significantly reduced OPEC's ability to set world prices. Trump is going to see, Trump has already spoken against some of Obama's regulations that slow down the exploitation of these resources. I think for Trump, looking to find well-paid blue-collar work that American citizens can do, providing cheap energy for the American economy that will make the U.S. less dependent on foreign sources and give the U.S. more power to undercut the revenue, whether it's of jihadi-producing Middle Eastern states or potential rivals like Russia. All of this makes a lot of sense for Donald Trump. And at the same time, I think he's already said he thinks climate change is a scam. What I'm quite sure, what he may or may not, that position may or may not change, but these sort of global international organizations that try to, in a sense, micromanage the world economy by saying, okay, this is how much energy, how much CO2 your country can emit, and you have to pay, the United States has to send a lot of money to developing countries to help them do climate and so on and so forth. He will have, I think, no sympathy with this. And, this, as long as Donald Trump is President of the United States, this process, to the extent that it goes on at all, will go on without American participation. I don't think that means that intelligent climate policy is impossible in the United States under a Trump presidency, but I do think it means that this sort of conventional green approach, global agreements, international bodies, that sort of thing, is a non-starter in the United States. Trump has already said that Obama's signature on these agreements does not bind him. I don't think that's going to change. His approach to Russia is another one that's obviously gotten a lot of attention. And we'll see in the press a lot of speculation. Is Trump, getting money from Russian banks? Why is he so friendly to Putin, et cetera, et cetera? Well, I'm not in a position to speculate on what a non-partial WikiLeaks that published Russian secrets as well as American secrets would say. So I don't, if Julian Assange weren't working for Russia, I don't know what we would be hearing, or at least rumored to be working for Russia. But I do, so I can't say anything about whether Trump has any connections with Russia in that way. But there is a geopolitical logic to his approach to Russia, which is, again, from his point of view, Russia is much less dangerous to the United States than China is. China is an economic threat in terms of manufacturing to the jobs of the people who vote for Trump. China is potentially a much greater power than Russia. Russia's economic weakness, its demographic problems, mean that while Russia can make trouble, one cannot imagine Russia as returning even to the level that the Soviet Union achieved. And after all, the United States and its allies were able to see the Soviets off pretty effectively in the Cold War. Trump would look at American threats, again, the threats to the U.S., I think, in a very Jacksonian way. He would look at ISIS and Sunni jihadi terrorism as a major threat, and he would see that Russia doesn't like that any more than we do, that Russia is as worried about what might happen in Chechnya or other parts of the Russian Federation as we are about what would happen in the United States, so maybe we can work on this. And he would probably also say that Russia has more reason long-term to be worried about China than the United States does. Russia has large amounts of empty, resource-rich land next to China, and China is growing faster than Russia and moving in many ways ahead of Russia. So that from a Trump point of view, reaching out to the weaker of the two, Russia or China, might make some sense. So I think we'll see that we'll see him at least testing that geopolitical logic. What's interesting, some of you may have seen that Putin is reducing the Russian defense budget by 27%, at least according to public documents. There may be a sense in which Trump may feel there is a deal to be cut. Again, from Trump's Jacksonian point of view, he's not as interested in things like the international order or international norms as most American presidents since the Second World War have been. For someone like President Obama, the fact that Russia has violated one of the fundamental norms of the international order by occupying Crimea makes that an unignorable challenge. Right? Trump's thinking may be more sort of Metternichian or, Westphalian, that actually these things like international order are just kind of fancy slogans, and what you really want to do is cut deals with different countries rather than create a kind of a global system that will settle all cases and prevent all things that you don't like. So he may not look at what's happening in Ukraine with the same sort of outrage that people who think in terms of the international liberal order as the first line of our common defense might do. And so from that perspective, Trump may find it easier to tolerate things in Putin. Trump is clearly not going to be as concerned about human rights and international law in a general way as President Obama. I don't mean by this that he's planning to torture a lot of people or to violate international law. That's not what I'm suggesting. But it's just that when he's dealing with, say, someone like Sisi in Egypt or Duterte in the Philippines or the Thai generals or others, he may well be less interested in what liberal internationalists would say would be the costs of tolerating this behavior to the health of global order. He doesn't maybe believe in global order as much as others do. And so for him, the decision of whether do you support Sisi is a much simpler, less agonized decision than it might be for President Obama. So in that sense, we may see a certain amount of realism in his approach, and that, again, I have to say, is something that Jacksonian politicians and the sort of Jacksonian thinkers have embraced for many centuries, really, in American history. This is not new or unusual. I guess I should probably finally say something about U.S.-Israel relations under Trump, in part because there's sort of talk about anti-Semitism and so on during the campaign. You may have seen that Trump and Netanyahu have had a call since the election, and Trump has invited Netanyahu to Washington. Netanyahu and Clinton, by the way, have also had a conversation since the campaign. No political candidate in American history, major party political candidate, has received a lower proportion of the Jewish vote than Donald Trump. Donald Trump got 18% of the Jewish vote. So he also got an Clinton also received an overwhelmingly larger share of Jewish campaign contributions than Trump did. Trump did have some Jewish backers, but Jewish money flowed much more to Clinton than to Trump, as indeed it flowed more to Obama than Romney, and to Obama rather than McCain, and Gore got more from than Bush. And so, you know, in the United States, sometimes when I'm overseas and people say to me, why do you Americans let the Jews control your foreign policy in the Middle East? I often find myself saying, especially in Europe, you know, if the Jews did control our Middle Eastern policy, you'd like it a lot better than the one we've got. American Jews are actually, by and large, well to the left of American public opinion more generally on the question of Israel. For Trump, supporting Israel, Trump sees Israel as a reliable realpolitik ally who brings a lot of assets. He notes that his relationship with Netanyahu causes him zero problems with Sisi. It causes him zero problems with Jordan. It causes him zero problems with the Arab sheikhs. And yet it brings many benefits. And the benefits that it brings are domestic as well as international, because Israel is very popular among Jacksonian Americans and has been, and this popularity has been growing since the 1967 war. Support for Israel used to be a left-wing thing in American politics. It's more and more becoming a right-wing thing. And for Trump's Jacksonian constituents, supporting Israel is something that they would like the president to do. It actually gives, it doesn't cost Trump domestically to support Israel. It benefits him. Again, not among Jews. He's not going to do much better than 18% of American Jews under any circumstances, but among non-Jewish Americans, because over 62% of Americans will tell pollsters that they sympathize with Israel, or, depending on how the question is asked, want U.S. policy to support it. So he'll be pro-Israel, even as he's pro-Egypt, probably more pro-Saudi than President Obama has been. The real question is going to be Iran, where Trump has campaigned hard against the Iranian nuclear deal, and that's a big issue in Republican circles and among Jacksonians. There's a lot of distrust of Iran among Jacksonian Americans. So, how he gets out of this, I don't know. If he steps away from the nuclear deal or allows the Iranians to do so, then presumably they reinstitute progress toward a bomb. Does that put Trump on a path to war? Hard to say. Hard to say. But I do think U.S.-Iranian relations will be a very, very fateful and difficult element of the Trump presidency. I'm sure I've spoken much too long, but you'll have to excuse me. This is a fascinating subject, and like most of you, I'm just beginning to think my way into what a Trump foreign policy would look like. Thank you for listening so patiently.
Thank you very, very much, Walter. That was, I think, the incredibly broad sweep that we were all looking for in coming here this evening. I have to say, particularly towards the end, your extremely rational view of the sort of policy priorities and leanings of the Trump presidency left me feeling rather more alarmed than reassured from a British and a European perspective. Because I think, as you were hinting, the list of areas where there are significant differences, not just of broad approach, but of practical approaches on the big issues. You ended with Iran, you mentioned climate change, there will be a whole range of them. It really is going to be a very difficult issue if we're going to try, from a British and a European and other allied perspective, to try to bridge some of these these differences in the period ahead. So, if I had a couple of questions, which I'm sure I don't want to go on too long about, because we want a discussion with our guests here this evening. One thing that strikes me about Trump is that maybe more than any president-elect that I can think of, he comes really not beholden to anybody. You express that in ideological terms, but the way the campaign was conducted, the way he handles himself, the importance of his own personality to the way he organizes things, means that he hasn't got a bunch of financial sponsors that he's beholden to. He hasn't had to deal in the past with constituents. He certainly hasn't got an international network that in some way will infiltrate his thinking. So he is, as I think you were saying, going to be very much his own man, reliant in the first stages on his family and the advisors he appoints, God help them, trying to get some advice through to him. So my first question really is about alliances, and you didn't talk about alliances, but they're, to anyone studying international relations, they're an important building block in international relations, and looked at from here and from a lot of other places around the world, Japan or the Middle East, including Israel, they would be an important element in what has made America great and what gives America strength for the future, because this is something which positively distinguishes and differentiates America from other superpower competitors. So where do you think Trump will come out on alliances, whether it's for reasons of values or whether it's because they are just a pragmatic way of amplifying your voice and your power and your point of view in the world? Because I think if you were sitting in Japan, and certainly if you're sitting in London, you would worry whether there was an interest in using alliances to the advantage of America above all, but certainly to our advantage as well. That's been a criticism of Obama, that he hasn't used the traditional alliances. Maybe for different reasons we're going to run up against a similar problem over Trump. And will, in his Russia policy, which you described, if it does turn out that way, that will be very, very problematic for any reaffirmation of the importance of NATO and seeing things through that particular prism. The Jacksonian slice of this policy would, I think, be quite worrying from a European point of view if it ended up with periods of relative passivity in foreign policy, letting Russia be Russia, letting other countries just get on with it, really defining downwards what represents a real interest to the United States and a real threat to the United States. If that is the situation, the normal situation, the risk then, as I see it, and as you hinted, is that in times of difficulty, when things aren't going so well, when suddenly you perceive a threat to be a real threat to America because things have actually caught up with you, you then don't have very much in the middle of policy making to fall back on. You haven't bothered to contain, you haven't bothered to use your economic power to bring people along with you. And you have relatively few tools at your disposal beyond the use of military power to get things done. So I think from an allied perspective, an oscillating American policy without some of the roots that we've come to rely on, but which can be redefined for the future, would be pretty worrying and pretty difficult, because you've written eloquently about the intermittent leadership message which Obama has given over the past 8 years. I can't quite see how the consistent message of leadership, which I think countries in Europe still want from America, is going to be found. So I hope that our audience will give you some interesting questions. I'd certainly like to hear more on Iran. Iran, for many in this country, is a controversial issue here too, but for many in this country was a good bit of diplomacy. It used Europe effectively, it used the transatlantic link effectively, and so far at least, it has not had poor consequences in Iran itself. We have an Iranian election among the many elections coming up with consequence next year. I know you had your criticisms, severe criticisms of the Iran deal. I think that will really be a big touchstone of transatlantic relations in the months ahead.
Okay. All right. Well, look, those were exactly the right questions, and I do want to say here that just to remind folks that I have an American accent, but I'm not here as a representative of the Trump administration or the American government. And I think, like many of us here, I'm a somewhat befuddled analyst trying to understand a phenomenon rather than an apologist trying to defend. I think the alliance question is a really good one. I am a strong believer in this network of alliances, and I would say also a strong believer in the special place that Britain has in this American network. The fact that I'm coming over here so quickly after the election, I hope I'm voting with my feet here to say something about this special relationship. But I'm not alone in that in the United States. It really, that relationship matters. I think it matters to President-elect Trump, though I'm not quite sure how in his sort of perspective it works. In one sense, he's a nationalist, and being close to Britain is part of the American national tradition, and therefore he's for it, in a sense. And in American domestic politics, just as the same people who are sort of anti-Israel to some degree are kind of anti-everything else Trump stands for, so often the people who are against a good U.S.-British relationship are often his political enemies at home. So there's a way in which those things may interestingly reinforce each other. I think what we're facing now is not so much settled ill will on Trump's part toward alliance structures in the way there may be a settled ill will toward dysfunctional global bureaucracies, but a lack of hands-on understanding of for what an important and difficult and fragile thing NATO is. How do you achieve this level of interoperability, of common outlook, of close personal relations among the career staff in so many different militaries, why that matters. I suspect that Trump is much more pro-Polish than he is pro-Ukrainian. And I'm not sure that he's fully factored in the degree to which anything that looks like a mixed signal on U.S. commitments to NATO destabilizes countries that are actually quite important to a number of people who voted for it. So I think this is going to be a work. We're going to be watching the education of Donald Trump. That has happened before. Bill Clinton had very little international experience when he became president. George W. Bush had very little, so did Barack Obama. These educations don't always go well, but I think it's certainly the case that every one of these people knew a lot more about how the international system works when they left office than they did when they came in. This will also probably happen to Trump. On Iran, again, I think my own criticisms, by the way, on the Iran deal have never been about whether it's a good thing to have one. It has been much more, I think, the failure to link progress on the nuclear file to some kind of stable arrangement in the region meant that instead of stabilizing the region, to some degree, the nuclear deal has made the region more chaotic. And that, what?
It's fairly chaotic.
It is fairly.
2015.
Yes, and that in a sense, both the Iranians and others took the willingness of the Americans and the P5+1 to pursue this deal, even as Iran rather flagrantly was crossing a lot of lines in the region, was read as a sign of great weakness and irresolution, both in Iran and in some other countries in the region, and so that tensions have sharpened and fears have increased. And really, the purpose of a nuclear deal is to reduce tension, reduce fears, reduce chances of greater conflict. So I think what we see is what Colin Powell called the invasion of Iraq, a catastrophic success. And I am a little concerned about that. I don't know where Trump takes it. And since it's very hard to reintroduce linkage at this stage. And here also, Trump's Iran policy and his Russia policy may be in an odd spot. Probably for Trump, the bottom line in some ways of the U.S. approach to the Middle East is this. With rising U.S. energy independence, the U.S. can afford to pull back from being as heavily engaged in everything that happens in the Middle East. And given how much blood and treasure we've spent, how much unhappiness for ourselves and others has resulted from this intense engagement, maybe we should try something else. I think that my own sense is that what he misses there is that while the U.S. is physically becoming ever less dependent on the Middle East as a source for oil, Britain isn't, Germany isn't, Japan isn't, China isn't. If there were some catastrophic series of events in the Middle East that interrupted the flow of oil on commercial terms to the rest of the world, there would be a massive worldwide depression that would make 2008 look like a garden party. And the United States economy would be as vulnerable, and the world financial system would be as vulnerable. So that, in fact, the dependence of the world economy on Middle Eastern oil is not a lot less than it used to be. But now the connection is harder for ordinary people to be aware of and follow. So it's going to be more difficult to get people to think seriously about the Middle East. And Trump, at least for the moment, I'm not sure that Trump has worked this thought process out to the bitter end.
We have an opportunity for a couple of questions from the audience, lots of hands. Let's take a lady there. With the microphone coming around.
Oh, thank you. You mentioned that Trump had come to power relatively unbeholden, but he has potential conflicts of interest in terms of the Trump empire. I think a lot of people could believe that he would see his own financial interest, that he would see his own financial interests personally as being largely overlapping with those of maybe America on the whole, but it's not impossible to imagine domestically situations where he would have personal conflict of interest with his role as president. Can you see his own personal interests also playing out on the international stage, and what would that look like?
Well, it's, it's possible. I don't actually think his international interests are large enough to loom, to be that much of a factor. But I do think that, that it will be interesting. We will now see whether he'll do what presidents have traditionally done, which is to put holdings in a blind trust and so on. I should point out, though, that George Washington actually arranged for the national capital to be located just a few miles from his plantation, in a place where he actually owned many of the lots in what would become the federal capital. That he also campaigned rather actively for infrastructure projects that would open roads to his large western land holdings in the rest. So there is precedent in American history for people to see some, not so much a conflict of interest as a convergence.
Gentleman over here.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Excellent. Right. Go back 100 years, and I think it's fair to say that this country was the world's, probably the world's largest power, arguably, at that time. But the feature over the last 100 years has been actual relative decline of this country, generally, and the growth of the United States largely at the expense of this country. I just wonder, the sort of more encouraging signs that one has now of a renewed special relationship, that sort of thing, with President Trump. Do you think that's any reflection of maybe a feeling in American society that there is a feeling of diminished power for the United States itself, and maybe that that actually this sort of, it's a sense of feeling as to what maybe this country went through maybe a century ago. I don't know, just a thought.
Yeah. Well, and you raise, the question of is America turning into another Britain is one that is constantly asked in the United States in various ways by various people. Sadly, it's almost never an optimistic, yes, we're becoming more like Britain and that's wonderful. It's, oh my goodness, we're going to decline just like that. So it's a dystopian kind of conversation in the United States. Of course, in France, it's a dystopian conversation. They talk about it becoming more American, so maybe it's even. I would say this. I am now far older than I wish I were, but all my life I have been in the midst of a constant conversation about American decline. In fact, when I was still in short pants in primary school, they changed my math curriculum because the Soviet Union succeeded in launching the Sputnik. And everyone in America and in the world was convinced that the Soviets were passing the U.S. in science and that America's doom was upon us. The first presidential election I remember was John Kennedy's election, which was dominated by the missile gap. The Soviet Union had passed the U.S. in missiles. We were now helpless and vulnerable before their might. This was immediately followed by the great trade deficit decline crisis of the 1960s, followed immediately by the Vietnam quagmire, now America really has declined for good. Immediately followed by Watergate, our institutions are failing, Bretton Woods is over. Then there was the Jimmy Carter era of malaise and decline. The Soviet Union is winning the Cold War. So it's then in the 80s, Japan was eating our lunch. That Japan, people thought literally did think about Japan in the way they think about China now. The irresistible juggernaut that will lay everything before us. We are helpless, we are lost. Okay, so what was it Orwell once said, that the dark night of fascism is always falling on America but landing on Europe. Arguably, the dark night of decline has often been cited falling, but hasn't yet been found. Now, maybe it has. Okay, maybe this is it. And after all of these false alarms, now is the moment. But my guess, by the way, is that when people look back at the Obama administration and ask what was the most important geopolitical developments of that period, one will be the arrival of a true growth crisis in China, where the Chinese model stopped working the way it had, and a different logic began. And the other was the development of fracking in the United States. So I think we may still feel like we're in decline and look like we're in decline and often act like we've declined quite a long ways. I'm not quite ready to say this time it's real.
Just a couple more questions. Gentleman the first. I'm going on eagerness. Gentleman the first.
That's setting up some very negative incentives out there. You should think hard about that.
If I may take my negative incentives in my hand, you mentioned President Jackson and President Roosevelt and President Reagan. Might there also be a case for comparing Donald Trump with the businessmen presidents of the interwar period, such as Warren Harding, Calvin Coolidge, and Herbert Hoover, at once more introspectively inclined and more autarkically minded? And in that case, might there not be a case for Britain and her other European allies to strengthen the European Union for the sake of safety, politically, economically, and possibly militarily, and while we are doing it here in London, to find a safe place for Brexit to die?
Well, I'm not going to get into the Brexit arguments, but I think what I would say is that, it may well be that the United States under Trump will be a little bit less sort of ready to run around and bark every time it hears an alarm in the night. But I'm not sure that that there is a viable European alternative. Europe, to me, looks considerably less united now than it did in the early 1990s, when the breakup of Yugoslavia essentially brought European processes to a halt. And if I look, when I listen to what people in Italy say about German policy and German ambitions, when it's very, very hard for me to actually see the case for a strong Europe. As an American, I would like there to be a strong Europe. I will say, my perfect record of being, on the losing side, I hoped Britain wouldn't leave the European Union, just as I hoped that Donald Trump wouldn't be elected President of the United States. But it has. And I think it did weaken NATO, it did weaken the coherence of the West a bit. Maybe it was worth it. That's something the Brits need to decide for themselves. But I do think that that the European alternative, who was it who once said that the debate in Europe over NATO or a European Defense Fund force was a question over which European defense initiative we would not fund. I don't see much real commitment in Europe to defense at this point. I wish there were.
Okay. Final question. We're going on eagerness and quality. So, this gentleman, no pressure, Sarah.
I found your analysis quite brilliant, and your analogies really with the other presidents is fascinating. But the trouble with Trump, as a lot of us see, it's not anything to do with that. He's erratic. He's incredibly egotistical, he's unpredictable, he behaves obsessively. Isn't that a problem? I mean, is he really a Roosevelt that can outthink his advisors? Or our real risk is really his personality? Now, perhaps you can't say anything about that, or that is what the world's worried about. You've been treating him as if he's as intelligent as you are. I don't think he is.
Well, I'm certainly not going to rise to that. But look, one doesn't know. Certainly, he is not. He's not what we would call book smart, but he may be street smart. President Obama was book smart, not particularly street smart, and which sometimes meant that President Obama was able to talk very intelligently about bad decisions that he made. I myself suffer from that failing. And so, Trump, certainly, I wouldn't go to Trump if I were looking for a lecture on the history of philosophy or theories of warfare or something. But if one looks at how his decisions have worked out since he decided to enter national politics, he's destroyed the two most powerful dynasties in the United States, taken over the Republican Party, smashed the Democratic Party, and he has done it without giving a lot of hostages to fortune. Maybe he's really stupid and really lucky, or and possibly the luck is about to run out, or maybe something else is at work. So at this point, I am at least prepared to entertain the possibility that there may be some kind of method in what still often does look to me like madness. Now, we'll see. Time will tell what we get. But I do think his track record in politics has not been the track record of an inconsequential buffoon.
Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for your time.
Paul, you Paul. Who are you?
It's
Okay, I'll call you
after a couple of